First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the organisers of the conference for inviting me, and I'd also like to express what an honour it is to be here talking in the United Arab Emirates in the year of Zayed, in the year that we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the great man's birth. And sorry about that. So what I would like to do, I can't see anything on the monitor for some reason. What I'd like to do today, in the 20 minutes that I've got, is I thought it'd be interesting to explore a little bit the origins of the UAE, to see how far back perhaps we can trace an entity of some sort, cultural, perhaps political, that might be seen as the genesis, the origin of the area that we now call the United Arab Emirates. A little bit ambitious, as you'll see, not completely intact yet, but I thought it'd be an interesting idea to play around with. We have to turn to archaeology in order to do this, because the historical sources are not really strong enough. If we look to local historical sources, we find that for the most part they're focused on Oman, especially on the Abadi traditions and so forth. There's actually very little before 100 years or so that is relevant to the area which we now call the UAE. If we turn to Western sources, then we get a slightly clearer picture in the latter years, but we do find that we're forced to focus a little bit on this concept of Trucial Oman, or the Trucial States, Trucial Oman as the British called it at the time. And that doesn't, I believe, help us very much, because when the treaty was signed between the British and the Sheikhs that live along the coast in the early 19th century, it was really only a formalization, I would argue, of an entity which already existed and had existed for some time, an entity or entities that had already existed. There are a few historical, you can see here the quote from probably one of the best English language historians of the area, Lorimer, who is pretty adamant in the fact that there's nothing, in his opinion, that is of very much use in chasing up this question before about the middle of the 18th century. There are a few facts that can be found here and there. Frauke Herd Bey mentions that, I don't know where she got this information from, but she suspects that during the 16th century or so, Sunni tribes such as the Beni Yas Confederation first became an important element of the Gharbiya, and started to create an entity that was distinct from the rest of Oman. We can see, in a similar way, we can see from about the middle of the 18th century, possibly from around the time of the death of Nadir Shah and the decline of Persian power in the Gulf, we can see the Qawasim, the Qasimi Confederation up in the north, including Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah. We can see that emerging perhaps as a tribal or political entity of some importance. And by about the middle of the 19th century, we see in the sources, it's clear that that things had become formalized between Oman and the tribes that live up here in this area, and the frontiers had become clearer and better established. But I would argue that all of these facts, and they're relatively limited facts, don't really help us very much in tracing the real origins of the United Arab Emirates as we might see it today. I think we could say that these are really what we see happening with these historical sources is the switching on of what André Gundar Frank called the narrow streetlight of history. The fact is that the entities that existed had already existed, I believe, for a much longer period, and it's only the advent of historical sources that allow us to see those entities. So we are forced to turn, if we want to go back in time, to the archaeological evidence to see what we can understand about this question. Now, the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today are ideas that have occurred to me over the last few years in reading about the archaeology of this area and studying it. I'm sure from conversations I've had over the last few days and weeks with various colleagues, and there are numerous specialists in various aspects here in this room, that many other people have shared similar observations. I'm going to be trying to trace archaeological evidence over a very long period of time in periods which I'm not expert, and there are people in this room who are much more expert than me. So I'm taking a great risk, personal risk here, actually. But fortunately, I'm a very courageous person, as you'll see. But it'll be interesting to see what other people think about the ideas. The first thing I think we have to say, and it's a very important point, is if we look at this area, this geographical entity here, by which I mean the Hadjar Mountains, the Musandam, and the Sia Plain, and so forth, what we could loosely call northern Oman and the UAE, the first and most important point to make, and I think everybody here would agree with this, is that it is clearly a coherent, homogeneous cultural entity through most of its history, distinct from the areas around it. And that's most clear, I believe, in the Umayyad period, the middle of the 3rd millennium and so forth, where we can see numerous sites, a very well-defined and standardized burial rite, very standardized pottery covering the whole area, about 500 kilometers, and similar organization in settlement. So a very homogeneous area. Some regional variation, no doubt, but on the whole, I think we would all agree that it holds itself together very clearly in terms of its material culture at that time. And the same thing can be said with a little bit less clarity about the Iron II period. These two periods, which are really represent in many ways economic apogees of the long-term development of the region. And we can talk about the Iron Age II period later, but on the whole, I think most people would agree that there's enough that holds this area together, more that holds it together than that separates it from the regions surrounding. And the point is made in this map here, that I think everybody would agree that the material culture of this region is very distinct from Dhofar for most of the history, and distinct from Qatar and Bahrain and eastern Saudi Arabia, Hormuzgan and Makran, the areas which surround it. So there's no doubt, I think, about that. What we actually call this area is a good question. The rather cumbersome name, the UAE in northern Oman, is perhaps the easiest to use in some ways. Southeast Arabia, a little bit vague. The Oman Peninsula, a little bit problematic politically in some areas. So we don't actually, it's an area without a name. The first time I began to think that there may be some notable distinction within this area that separates out the area that we now call the UAE was when I was working on the publication of Carnal Half, the Wadi Souk excavations in Ras Al Khaimah, and looking at the distribution of Wadi Souk tombs. After the breakdown of the Umayyad culture at about 2000 and that very homogeneous burial rite, we see the emergence of various different tomb structures across the area. And if we map them, you can just about see the colors I've tried to use, the collective surface-built burials, which outlined in blue, which are typical of Ras Al Khaimah particularly, the subterranean collective burials of the Northern Emirates and down as far about as Al Ain, and to some degree into northern Oman, you can see marked in red. And then the single cyst burials of the Wadi Souk period are marked in green, and they're spread across the whole region. Now, as you can see, there's a bit of a mix, especially in the cyst burials. But if we subdivide the region into the predominant burial type during the Wadi Souk period, then we can see the emergence of three quite distinct regions, I believe. And it's very clear that the area, the green area, within which the cyst burials are the predominant burial type for most of the Wadi Souk period, corresponds very broadly to the area outside the area that we now call the UAE. The border, of course, is a little bit vague. The border I would put somewhere in between, a line between, say, Kalba and Al Ain, all the way down to somewhere around about Yankul and Kabura. Within that region, it's a rather vague border, and we can't expect any such borders to have been precise at any time in history. We're talking about rough cultural arrangements rather than political entities, probably. So that's the first observation that I would make, and it's what first turned my attention to this question. We can explain it somehow and back up that observation by a look at a very crude and not complete look at the distribution of Dilmun period, or Bahraini rather, imports at this time from the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium, and which consists mostly of these funerary jars and red ridged ware, for the most part. And the map there, which has obviously been made quite quickly with a felt pen, shows a picture more or less as it is. And there's a line about there, south of which there are rather few of such imports, north of which they're much more common. And I think that simply tells us that the map I just showed you of tomb distributions is reflecting, to some degree, a different orientation. The northern area is really looking towards the Gulf, and particularly towards the emergence of Dilmun, whereas the central Hajar Mountains are really looking in a different direction at that point, and are possibly much less connected at this time to what's going on in the Gulf. The oldest observation that might be placed in this discussion was published just 4 or 5 years ago by Vincent Charpentier and Rémi Crassard in a paper in Arabian Archaeology and Epigraphy, in which they re-examined the famous facade points. The facade points are a very important flint technology that represents really the emergence of the Holocene after the Pleistocene and the Paleolithic. And you can see some examples there. What Vincent and Rémi did is they re-examined the facade points and created 3 new types. And one type, the type they call the fire type, is located, and you can see on this map here, the dark diamonds, are located, as they say in their article, almost entirely within the modern UAE borders. And I've put the modern UAE border on that map to show you. It's actually quite remarkable. So if we accept this as the earliest evidence of a cultural entity which is in some way distinct, then that takes us back to somewhere between 11,000 and 9,000 years ago for something that we might call the genesis of the United Arab Emirates. And that's quite incredible. You may, though, disagree with my conclusions. Let's go to the Hafid period, because one more point there is, if you look at that map, you can see that the point I made about the homogeneity of the Jebel Akhtar and the UAE area isn't true at this time. Facade points are actually spread all the way down into Dhofar. So this is not yet quite that first emergence of a cultural entity which we call Northern Oman and the United Arab Emirates. That first emerges in the Hafid period at around about the end of the 4th millennium BC. And this is a map made by a PhD student, William Dedman, showing the rough distribution of these stone burial cairns, most of which are located on high ridge tops and hilltops. And you can see some photographs of them there. And they're found right across this area. Will did a very interesting thing. He looked at the orientation of the entrances. Using a simple schoolboy compass, he looked at the fact that when these tombs were built, it seems that the people who built them oriented the entrance towards the sunrise for whatever religious reasons they had. And he was able, in the Wadi Andam area of Oman, to show that down in the lower parts of the area, they were oriented generally probably towards sunrise during the summertime. And in the winter, it may be that they were going up into the mountains, by which time the sun had moved, and they were building their tombs oriented in a slightly different direction. Now, that's all very interesting, but it's not the point I want to make today. The point I want to make today is when he mapped on the broader map the orientation of those tombs, you can see from this plan that in the area of the eastern Hajar Mountains, that is where whoever was building these tombs was interested in orienting their tombs towards sunrise. Whereas when we move to the north, and these based this on published evidence, the tombs don't follow the same orientation. In fact, they seem to be oriented with the topography. The border between those two areas isn't very close to the modern border between the UAE and Oman. It's rather far distant. That's the modern border, more or less. So you can see that it's not quite working. We've still got, in the area of the central or the western Hajar Mountains, is where the distinction takes place. But nonetheless, it's still moving, I would argue, in that direction, in the direction of creating a cultural entity in the north, which is in some way separate from a cultural entity in the south. The reason for this difference, the reason for this distinction isn't clear, but it seems to me likely that it reflects a different religious orientation of the people who built those structures that otherwise look to us rather homogeneous, and might suggest that within that architectural homogeneity there were perhaps different belief systems that existed. Now I'm moving on to the work of Christian Felder, who's sitting here in the audience, and this is a very important paper that he published in 2003, where he more or less invented the late Bronze Age, and there are some of the chlorite vessels and pottery vessels that he used to define that. And if we look at the map, the sites that he used in that 2003 paper to define the Late Bronze Age, marked there in red with the addition of Felder, which he didn't mention in that paper, and we can see that they concentrate almost entirely in the region within the region that we now call the United Arab Emirates. And over the last 15 years or so since that paper was published, that distinction, I believe, has more or less been maintained. Certainly the work that I've been doing recently at Rustaq in Oman on the Bartana, but we haven't found a single sherd, or 3 sherds, I think, possible Late Bronze Age sherds amongst about 20,000 sherds that we've picked up. So although there may be 1 or 2 exceptions, for the most part, the Late Bronze Age is focused almost entirely up there in the north. A very marked cultural distinction, suggesting something quite different was going on in the area of the UAE at that time compared to what was going on in the core of the Jebel Akhtar. I move now to the work of Peter McGee, and Peter also invented an archaeological period of his own. It's a little bit shorter and a little bit more ambiguous, I would say. I think he would probably accept that. Those of you that attend the Seminar for Arabian Studies will have enjoyed numerous discussions between him and Carl Phillips over the years about this question. It's a period which only lasts a couple of 100 years and is defined by a rather limited amount of development, very little trade, rather poorly organized and constructed settlements, and rather poor quality pottery. But when we look at the sites where the Iron I period can be identified, they also are focused almost entirely in the north. Now, there may be, and I'll talk about archaeological bias, possible archaeological bias a little bit later, but we don't know exactly the reason for that. But it might be, again, an indication that the northern area was behaving in a different way to the main part of the Jebel Akhtar. Moving now to Paul Yule's work on what we call, well, again, it's a period with no good name, a period that we would probably call the classical period in the Western tradition. In India, they call it the early historic period. Here, we've got a French name, the Pré-Islamic Récent, for the northern part, and the Samad period, which I think Paul Yule has now abandoned for the main. So it's a complicated period. But what Paul Yule has done is he's identified 2 quite distinct material cultures at this time, from about the 3rd century BC until about the 3rd century AD. And I think most people would accept that is broadly correct. And if we look on this map, we can see the red dots indicate the location of PIR, or Pré-Islamic Récent finds, and the bluish area shows the distribution of Samad period finds. And you can see, once again, that the distinction, the border, exists more or less in the area that I've already defined. There I've put the modern UAE border on that map now more clearly so that you can see where we are. As I said, it's not exact, and we're not talking about precise political boundaries. To develop the PIR a little bit further, I'll just mention the idea of hilltop forts. Hilltop forts are something that first begins to occur in this area in the Iron Age. But the interesting thing is, as we move into the Samad PIR period, they continue to be used in the Jebel Akhtar and the main part of northern Oman, whereas up in the north, in the PIR area, we see the development of something quite different. And that is these independent square forts with corner towers, for the most part square and then later on rounded. And we find these sites at places like Adur, Maleha, now just recently at Fulaj, and a couple of other places. So for me, those forts represent the import of a completely new military technology, a military technology that was at the present time spreading its way on the back of Hellenism, Hellenization perhaps, across the Middle East, a new type of concept, a military concept, built down, the forts are built down on the plain next to the settlement, not up on the hill. So again, looking at the map, the distribution of these 2 different types of military construction during the Samad PIR period, we can see again that it's the northern area, the United Arab Emirates area, where this new military technology has been imported. So again, suggesting that this northern area was behaving in some ways quite differently to the Jebel Akhtar. During the Sasanian period, which is something that I work on, I've nearly finished it, coming to the end of my time, is a period that I work on, we can again, a period of perhaps economic stress, we can see that the vast majority of known archaeological finds from this time, many of which consist of isolated burials, are all located up in the north. Very few down the south. The recent find and excavation of a late Sasanian fort at Falej, near to Sohar, near to Saham, on the north of the Bartana, has brought up an interesting question. It's a very sturdy fort. Why is it located in that location? We started off interpreting it using the famous mention of the treaty from Al-Utaybi, the potential 10th century source, who describes a treaty that was signed between the Persians and the local Julanda at this time, just in the period before, just before the rise of Islam, or the arrival of Islam into this region. And based on that treaty, the idea suggested is that the Julanda, the local Arabs, controlled the interior of the country, whilst the Persians, the colonial Persians, controlled the coast. So we've generally thought that the area of Persian control may well have been the two areas outlined in blue, and Falej might be seen as a Persian fort defending those areas. But based on what I've been saying today, I've been changing my thinking a little bit, and I'm beginning to wonder whether Falej might be seen as a fort that's actually located protecting that red border, the distinction that I've already described to you, and especially in the PIR Samad period, distinction between the Jebel Akhtar and the northern area, which is now the UAE. And the final point, really, because we could take this into the Islamic period, but I'm not going to. The Islamic period becomes more complicated because in the Islamic period, the material culture is an imported material culture, especially the pottery and other finds, which is very difficult to distinguish local regional variations, and in fact, in which the whole of this area becomes very much part of a much bigger material culture spreading from Iraq, Iran, and the whole of Arabia. So the material culture approach doesn't really work once we come into the Islamic period. But we can see, and Frauke Herd-Bey has suggested this as well, although on the basis of very little evidence, that we might see already at this time a distinction between the UAE area and the rest of Oman. But certainly, with the rise of Ibadism in Oman at this time, we know that the caliphs, the early Umayyad caliphs and the Abbasid caliphs who came to this region to try to take back control from the Ibadis, the 3 or 4 battles that are mentioned all took place within the modern area of the United Arab Emirates. Why? That's because, of course, it's where they would have accessed this area, sailing by ship from Basra, from Mesopotamia, from Iraq. And that, again, I think, reflects a little bit of why, perhaps, we can see this distinction throughout history. It's that contact. So I'm going to have to move a little bit. I'll forget this point, which wasn't so strong. How do we explain these patterns very rapidly? Well, one possibility, of course, is that we might be looking at archaeological bias. Although there are many people here who work... Sorry about that, it was a bit of a joke. There are many people here who work in both areas. There are lots of people who work only either in the UAE or in Oman. And the danger of that is, of course, is that they develop their own typologies, their own interpretations, and that border, in fact, reflects to some degree the modern political border for those that work in the Sultanate of Oman and those that work in the United Arab Emirates. That's a possible thing and something that we have to be aware of. But on the whole, I think the strength of the archaeological evidence is good, and I don't think we are talking about archaeological bias. Could we explain these differences by geographical determinants? For example, the pearl beds, which would have created a different economic orientation for the Gulf-facing sheikdoms. Or rainfall. There is a higher rainfall up in the north. There's the orographic effect of the mountains, which gives a higher rainfall. So that in periods of economic stress or climatic stress, it might be that the northern area behaved differently because of that. And also, if we look at the distribution of afflage, they're much more concentrated within the Jebel Akhtar area, and that might also have led to a different social and political organization. But on the whole, I'm not convinced by these arguments. And for me, and this is the last slide, I think the point that I've been trying to make throughout this talk is that this northern area, the United Arab Emirates, is really more exposed to Iraq, Bahrain and eastern Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and has been throughout its entire history, and thereby has created a slightly different cultural and intellectual, technological orientation, which has kept it distinct. And I think that reflects very much what we see in the modern United Arab Emirates today. So, if you like, I'm putting forward the argument that we can actually define an area which we can now call the United Arab Emirates, which is as much as 10,000 years old. Thank you very much.